The radio crackled with tension as Commander Joseph Rockefort hunched over his desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor's Naval Intelligence Headquarters. It was May 27, 1942, and the intercepted Japanese messages painted a picture that made his blood run cold. The enemy was planning something massive, something that could tip the balance of the Pacific War forever. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and America was still reeling from the psychological blow. The Japanese Empire had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave, conquering territory from Southeast Asia to the Central Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Wake Island had fallen, Guam was lost, and the Philippines were crumbling under the weight of Japanese assault. The American public watched in horror as their mighty Pacific fleet appeared powerless against the rising sun. But Rockefort and his team of cryptanalysts had been working tirelessly to crack the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25. Their breakthrough came through painstaking analysis of intercepted radio transmissions, revealing that the Japanese were planning a major offensive against a target they referred to only as AF. Through a clever ruse involving a fake water shortage report from Midway, they confirmed that AF was indeed the strategic atoll that served as America's forward base in the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm. The Japanese plan was audacious in its scope. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where he could destroy them once and for all. The Japanese combined fleet would approach Midway with overwhelming force. 4 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and over 150 support vessels carrying Japan's most elite pilots and newest aircraft. The trap was elegantly conceived. While a diversionary force attacked the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, drawing American attention northward, Yamamoto's main force would strike Midway with devastating effect. The atoll would fall, and when the American carriers arrived to reclaim it, they would face annihilation against superior numbers. It was a plan that could secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific for generations to come. As referenced in historical documentation from the National World War II Museum, the stakes could not have been higher. Had Japan won the battle as thoroughly as the U.S. did, it might have been able to capture Midway Island, leaving America with only the carrier Saratoga to defend the entire Pacific until new ships could be completed. Yet Nimitz possessed something Yamamoto did not expect: foreknowledge. The American admiral began assembling every available ship in the Pacific, knowing that this might be the last chance to halt Japanese expansion. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, recently returned from the famous Doolittle raid on Tokyo, were hastily prepared for battle. The damaged Yorktown, limping back from the Coral Sea engagement, was rushed into dry dock for emergency repairs that would normally take months. The American fleet was outnumbered 2-1, with many of their pilots inexperienced compared to Japan's veteran aviators. But they had one crucial advantage: they knew the enemy was coming. As the last week of May 1942 drew to a close, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 3, 1942, revealing an ocean that appeared deceptively calm. Beneath the surface, however, the greatest naval drama of the war was about to unfold. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, positioned his ships 200 miles northeast of Midway, exactly where intelligence suggested they could strike the Japanese fleet at its most vulnerable moment. Meanwhile, Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the hastily repaired Yorktown led Task Force 17 into position. The carrier had been patched up in just 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, a miraculous feat of American industrial determination. Her flight deck bore the scars of battle from the Coral Sea, but her aircraft were ready for action. Fletcher, as senior admiral, assumed overall command of the American forces, coordinating with Spruance in a delicate dance of naval strategy. The Japanese approach was methodical and confident. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the 1st Air Fleet, led his 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, through the pre-dawn darkness. These were the same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor, and their crews were flush with victory after 6 months of uninterrupted conquest. The Rising Sun Naval Ensign flew proudly from their masts as they closed in on what they believed would be another easy triumph. At 5:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched his first wave against Midway. 108 aircraft roared from the carrier decks, their engines creating a symphony of destruction as they formed up and headed toward the American base. The Japanese pilots were among the world's finest, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific who had never known defeat. Their Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi Val dive bombers were escorted by the deadly Mitsubishi Zero fighters that had dominated every aerial engagement of the war thus far. On Midway itself, the small garrison of Marines and airmen waited with grim determination. Colonel Harold Shannon commanded the air defenses, knowing that his obsolete aircraft stood little chance against the approaching Japanese formations. The island's radar had detected the enemy at 5:20, giving barely enough time to scramble the defending fighters. Brewster Buffalo fighters, already obsolete before the war began, climbed desperately to intercept the Japanese strike. The battle for Midway Atoll was brief but savage. Japanese bombs rained down on the airfield, destroying hangars and setting fuel tanks ablaze. The Marine defenders fought with desperate courage, but their outdated equipment was no match for Japanese superiority. Within minutes, the airfield was a smoking ruin, and Nagumo's pilots were reporting back that a second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize the base. It was this moment of apparent victory that sealed Japan's fate. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the attack, radioed back to the fleet, "There is need for a second attack wave." The message reached Nagumo at 6:30, and the Japanese admiral faced a crucial decision. His remaining aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, prepared for the naval battle he expected to fight later in the day. Converting them to attack Midway would require precious time to rearm and refuel. Unknown to Nagumo, American search planes were already shadowing his fleet. At 6 o'clock, a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Howard Audie spotted the Japanese carriers and transmitted the electrifying message. "Enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 180. The information raced back to the American task forces, where Fletcher and Spruance realized that their moment had arrived. The Japanese had walked into the trap perfectly. While Nagumo debated his next move, American strike aircraft were already warming up on distant carrier decks. The hunters had become the hunted, and neither side yet realized that the next few hours would determine the course of the Pacific War. The flight deck of the USS Enterprise thrummed with controlled chaos as the morning of June 4 unfolded. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the air group, watched his pilots make final preparations for what everyone knew would be the most important mission of their lives. The intelligence was clear. 4 Japanese carriers lay somewhere ahead, and this might be America's only chance to strike them before they could launch their own devastating attack. At 7 o'clock, Admiral Spruance made the fateful decision to launch immediately, even though his aircraft were at the extreme edge of their operational range. The Enterprise and Hornet began launching their strike groups, sending every available aircraft into the morning sky. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, took off in their lumbering TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, aircraft that were already obsolete but carried the hopes of a nation. The American strike suffered from poor coordination almost immediately. The different squadrons lost contact with each other in the vast expanse of the Pacific, and many would never find their targets. Waldron's Torpedo 8 flew directly toward where he believed the Japanese fleet would be, guided by instinct and determination rather than precise navigation. His 15 aircraft represented the entire torpedo striking power of the Hornet, and every man aboard knew they were flying toward almost certain death. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was wrestling with a decision that would haunt him forever. The returning Midway strike force was requesting permission to land, but his hangar decks were filled with aircraft being rearmed for a second attack on the island. At 7:15, a Japanese scout plane reported sighting American ships to the northeast, but the message was incomplete and confusing. Were they warships or merely transports? The answer came at 7:28 when the scout plane transmitted the words that changed everything. Enemy ships appeared to be 10 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo's heart must have stopped. American warships in the area meant carriers, and carriers meant the trap he had feared was closing around him. He immediately ordered his aircraft to be rearmed with anti-ship weapons, but the process would take precious time. At 9:20, the first American attack reached the Japanese fleet. Torpedo 8 found the enemy carriers exactly where Waldron had predicted, but the sight that greeted them was terrifying. For massive carriers were surrounded by a screen of destroyers and cruisers, their decks busy with aircraft preparation. Zero fighters swarmed up to meet the approaching Americans, and the slaughter began immediately. The TBD Devastators were death traps against the nimble Zeros. One by one, Waldron's aircraft were shot down, their crews dying in the Pacific swells far from home. The torpedo bombers were too slow, too cumbersome, and too poorly armed to survive against Japanese fighters. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 aircraft were destroyed, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to watch the battle from his life raft. The sacrifice of Torpedo 8 was repeated again and again as other American squadrons found the Japanese fleet. Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise and Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown met similar fates, their crews dying in desperate low-level attacks that achieved nothing but to draw Japanese fighters down to sea level. The American torpedo attack was a complete failure, accomplishing nothing except to give the Japanese confidence that their superiority remained intact. But the sacrifice was not in vain. While the Zeros were busy massacring the torpedo bombers at low altitude, they were perfectly positioned for what came next. High above the Japanese fleet, unnoticed in the confusion of battle, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise had finally found their target. At 10:26, as the Japanese fighters were still scattered and low on fuel, McCluskey rolled over into his attack dive. The next 4 minutes would change the course of the Pacific War. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, their pilots finally given the chance to prove their worth, screamed down through the morning sky toward the Japanese carriers below. The trap that had been set with such careful intelligence work was about to be sprung, and the Japanese fleet was about to learn that their moment of triumph had become their hour of greatest peril. The morning sun glinted off the wings of Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's SBD Dauntless as he pushed over into his dive at 10:26. Below him, the Japanese carrier Kaga stretched across the blue Pacific like a steel island, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being hastily prepared for launch. The irony was not lost on experienced pilots like McCluskey. The same dive bombing tactics that had made American naval aviation famous were about to be used against the creators of carrier warfare themselves. The attack was beautifully coordinated by accident. While McCluskey's Enterprise squadrons approached the Kaga and Akagi from the southeast, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers had found the Soryu from the southwest. The Japanese carriers, caught in the middle of rearming their aircraft, were at their most vulnerable moment. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks, ordnance was stacked in the open, and the precious Zeros that had been slaughtering American torpedo bombers were now either low on fuel or refueling. McCluskey's first section dove on the Kaga with deadly precision. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, flying as McCluskey's wingman, watched his 1,000-pound bomb tear through the carrier's flight deck near the island superstructure. The explosion was immediately followed by secondary blasts as the bomb detonated among the armed and fueled aircraft below. Within seconds, the entire forward section of the ship was engulfed in flames that would soon spread throughout the vessel. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, suffered an even more devastating fate. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the second section of Enterprise bombers, placed his bomb directly amidships on the flight deck. The explosion penetrated to the hangar level where it ignited fuel and ammunition, creating a chain reaction that turned the ship into a floating inferno. The carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was doomed within minutes of the first bomb impact. Meanwhile, the Soryu was receiving similar treatment from the Yorktown's dive bombers. Leslie's attack was textbook perfect, with 3 direct hits that shattered the carrier's flight deck and started uncontrollable fires below. The Japanese damage control teams, despite their skill and courage, were overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately and escaped the initial American assault. Her commander, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, was a brilliant tactician who immediately recognized both the disaster that had befallen his fleet and the opportunity that remained. The Hiryu still had operational aircraft, and if he could locate and destroy the American carriers, the battle might still be won despite the terrible losses. At 10:58, Yamaguchi launched his first counterstrike. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, raced toward the last known position of the American fleet. The Japanese pilots were among the Navy's finest, and they carried with them the hopes of salvaging something from the morning's catastrophe. Their target was the Yorktown, the carrier that had survived the Coral Sea and returned to fight again. The attack on the Yorktown demonstrated why Japanese naval aviation had dominated the Pacific for so long. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and aggressive defense by American fighters, Kobayashi's dive bombers pressed home their attack with suicidal determination. 3 bombs struck the carrier, penetrating her flight deck and starting fires that threatened to consume the ship. The Yorktown, so hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, seemed destined to become the Japanese revenge for the morning's losses. But American damage control had improved dramatically since Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown's crew, led by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, fought the fires with skill and determination that matched their Japanese opponents. Within an hour, the carrier was making 20 knots and operating aircraft again, a recovery that seemed impossible to Japanese observers. When Yamaguchi launched his second strike at 1:31, the Hiryu's pilots reported that they had sunk 2 American carriers, not knowing they had attacked the same ship twice. The Hiryu's success was short-lived. At 5 o'clock, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown found the last Japanese carrier. The attack was led by Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, whose pilots had already proven themselves earlier in the day. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu, and like her sister ships, she was soon a burning wreck drifting powerlessly in the Pacific swells. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the Japanese combined fleet was in full retreat. 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, had been destroyed along with their irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. The divine wind that had carried Japan to victory across the Pacific had suddenly reversed direction, and the rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy. The Battle of Midway was not yet over, but the decisive moment had passed. America had proven that her resolve in the Pacific was unbreakable, and the Japanese Empire had learned that their seemingly invincible fleet could be defeated by courage, intelligence, and the growing might of American industrial power. The Pacific dawn of June 5 revealed a seascape transformed by the previous day's carnage. Where once four proud Japanese carriers had steamed in perfect formation, only oil slicks and debris marked their final resting places. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had already slipped beneath the waves, taking with them not just steel and machinery, but the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The Hiryu, still burning but stubbornly afloat, would follow them into the depths before the day was through. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his battleship Yamato, received the catastrophic reports with a stoic dignity that had made him a legend in the Imperial Navy. His carefully crafted plan to destroy American naval power in the Pacific had backfired spectacularly. The intelligence advantage he had counted on was gone, replaced by an American foreknowledge that had turned hunters into prey. As he studied the damage reports, Yamamoto realized that Japan had lost not just four carriers, but the war itself. The human cost was staggering beyond mere numbers. When the Battle of Midway ended, Japan had lost four carriers, a cruiser and 292 aircraft, and suffered an estimated 2,500 casualties, as documented by military historians. More devastating than the ships themselves was the loss of experienced pilots and aircrew. Japan's naval aviation had been built around a core of superbly trained professionals who had years of experience in combat. These men could not be replaced quickly, and their loss would cripple Japanese offensive capabilities for the remainder of the war. The final act of the battle played out with the Yorktown, the American carrier that had survived two separate Japanese attacks through the skill of her crew and the effectiveness of her damage control. Captain Buckmaster had ordered the ship abandoned when it appeared she might capsize, but the veteran carrier proved more resilient than anyone expected. On June 6, salvage crews re-boarded the ship and began the delicate process of taking her under tow. It was then that the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, found the wounded American carrier. Tanabe had been stalking the American fleet for days, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The Yorktown, dead in the water and surrounded by rescue vessels, presented a target too tempting to ignore. At 1:36 in the afternoon, he fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the carrier and her escorts. The USS Hammond, a destroyer tied alongside the Yorktown to provide power and assistance, took 1 torpedo amidships and broke in half almost instantly. The explosion killed 81 sailors and demonstrated the continuing danger that lurked beneath the Pacific surface. 2 more torpedoes struck the Yorktown, sealing her fate. The carrier that had survived the Coral Sea and Midway finally succumbed to her wounds, rolling over and sinking at dawn on June 7. The loss of the Yorktown provided a sobering reminder that victory in the Pacific would not come without continued sacrifice. Yet the strategic implications of Midway were already clear to both sides. American industrial might, fully unleashed after Pearl Harbor, was beginning to tip the balance of power in the Pacific. New carriers were under construction in American shipyards, and pilot training programs were producing aviators in numbers that Japan could never match. For Japan, Midway represented the high watermark of their Pacific expansion. The combined fleet, once seemingly invincible, had been revealed as vulnerable to determined American resistance. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of uninterrupted victory, had been shattered in the space of a single morning. Japanese naval strategists realized that their window of opportunity to secure a decisive victory was rapidly closing. The battle's aftermath reverberated through both governments. In Washington, the victory provided proof that American intelligence and industrial capabilities could overcome even the most carefully planned Japanese operations. President Franklin Roosevelt, buoyed by the news from Midway, authorized expanded Pacific operations that would soon put Japan on the defensive throughout the region. In Tokyo, the disaster was initially concealed from the Japanese public, but the military leadership understood the implications immediately. The loss of 4 fleet carriers meant that Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific was permanently reduced. The pilots and aircrew who died at Midway represented years of training and experience that could never be recovered. The divine wind that had carried Japan to victory across the Pacific had shifted, and American resolve in the region was now an undeniable force that would shape the remainder of the war. The sun rose on June 8, 1942, over a Pacific Ocean forever changed. The last debris from the Yorktown was disappearing beneath the waves, but the implications of the Battle of Midway were only beginning to ripple across the vast theater of war. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received reports that confirmed what his intelligence staff had dared to hope. The Japanese combined fleet was in full retreat, abandoning not only the Midway operation but also the planned invasion of the Aleutian Islands. The The victory was sweeter for having been achieved against such overwhelming odds. American forces had faced the same Japanese fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor, commanded by the same admirals who had conquered half the Pacific. Yet through superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and raw courage, the outnumbered American forces had achieved one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The psychological impact was as important as the strategic one. America had proven it could beat Japan at their own game. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation skills had led the Enterprise dive bombers to their targets, was awarded the Navy Cross for his role in the victory. His decision to continue searching when his fuel was running low had changed the course of the entire battle. Similarly, the surviving members of Torpedo 8, who had sacrificed themselves to draw Japanese fighters away from the dive bombers, were posthumously honored for their courage. The battle had created heroes from ordinary men who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Central Pacific had been severely compromised. The loss of 4 fleet carriers meant that future Japanese operations would be limited in scope and effectiveness. More importantly, the experienced pilots and aircrew who had been the backbone of Japanese naval aviation were gone forever. As referenced in National Park Service historical analysis, the Japanese lost 332 of their finest aircraft and more than 200 of their most experienced pilots, losses that would handicap Japanese operations for the remainder of the war. American industrial capacity, now fully mobilized for war production, would ensure that the balance of power continued to shift in favor of the United States. New Essex-class carriers were already under construction, and pilot training programs were producing aviators in numbers that Japan could never match. The Battle of Midway had bought America the time it needed to bring its full industrial might to bear against the Japanese Empire. The Japanese High Command, led by Admiral Yamamoto, attempted to salvage something from the disaster by accelerating other planned operations. The attack on the Aleutian Islands proceeded as scheduled, but without the carrier support that had been intended to follow up the Midway victory. The capture of Attu and Kiska provided little strategic value and would eventually drain Japanese resources without significant benefit. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the disaster in carefully worded reports that minimized the extent of the losses, began to understand that the war was taking a direction different from what his military leaders had promised. The quick victory that had been predicted after Pearl Harbor was proving elusive, and American resistance was growing stronger rather than weaker. The divine wind that had protected Japan from foreign invasion for 7 centuries seemed to have shifted direction. In the months following Midway, the initiative in the Pacific began to pass to American forces. The landing at Guadalcanal in August 1942 marked the beginning of the American offensive that would eventually carry the war to Japan's home islands. Each subsequent battle would demonstrate the growing strength of American naval aviation and the declining capabilities of Japan's once mighty combined fleet. The Battle of Midway had proven America's resolve in the Pacific beyond any doubt. The nation that had been stunned by Pearl Harbor had recovered to deliver a crushing blow to Japanese naval power. The victory demonstrated that American industrial capacity, intelligence capabilities, and fighting spirit could overcome even the most carefully planned enemy operations. The turning tide in the Pacific had begun, and the long road to Tokyo Bay was now open to American forces determined to finish what Japan had started on December 7, 1941. The triumph at Midway would be remembered as the moment when America proved that its resolve in the Pacific was unbreakable, and that the rising sun of Japanese imperialism had begun its long, inevitable descent toward defeat.